Good afternoon, and welcome to Monticello. My name is John Ragosta. I'm the Interim Director at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies here at Monticello, and we're so glad that you could join us this afternoon. It's part of our program, but also a program of Virginia Humanities, the Virginia Festival of the Book, a wonderful event here every March. Now, the Virginia Festival of the Book is run by Virginia Humanities, and the programs are all free, but they're not free to put on. So if you would like to make a contribution to Virginia Humanities, it would be very, very much appreciated. Now, this program, Virginia Festival of the Book this year, has a special sponsor, the Robert and Joseph Cornell Memorial Foundation. They've also supported Monticello over the years, so we want to very much thank them for their support. But I want to get right into our program because it's a special pleasure to be here today with Ed Larson and have the chance to introduce Ed. Of course, he has a wonderful academic experience. He received his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, studied law at Harvard, and has written any number of books. I won't go through the whole list. It would take up too much of our time. But most significantly, Summer of the Gods, a Pulitzer Prize winning volume, as well as A Magnificent Catastrophe, The Election of 1800, something of particular interest. We may get into that yet this afternoon. He has taught around the world. He has taught at Leiden. He has taught at Stanford, at Melbourne, at Georgia, a number of different places. But today we're going to be talking about his latest work. It's just out in March. American Inheritance, Liberty and Slavery and the Birth of a Nation, 1765 to 1795. And Ed and I are going to have a bit of a conversation, and then we hope to save some time because we'd be very interested in your questions on the book. After we're done, Ed will be available for a book signing over in our shop for a little bit, so we hope you'll also have the opportunity to buy his book, or I see some of you already have it. I'm sure he would be happy to sign the book. Now, Ed, when I had the opportunity to teach, and especially undergraduates, I would often tell the students, when somebody writes a book, they've got a reason why they're writing it. They're not doing it for the money. Most
No, you're
now,
not.
Ed sells more books. Most
But not
academic
enough.
books, if they sell 1,000 copies, that's a good academic book. So when someone takes all of that time and that energy to write a book, they're trying to make a particular point. So this is a wide open question. What were you trying to tell us?
Well, in part, it was my COVID project. It was a chance when we were all trapped in our houses. And I took a few trips. I did a visiting gig up at Yale while I was working on this. But many of these materials, as you know, now are available online. They weren't when I was first doing my books, but you can get many of these online. There are also a lot of archivists who were free, had extra time, and could search out my requests. So it was a project to do that, but when COVID hit, I was midway on my book tour for my previous book, which was Franklin and Washington, the founding partnership. And what people had found most interesting when I was going around making my tour, talking different places, literally cut down in the middle of it. They literally closed the last half of my stops for COVID. I found that people were most interested in the last chapter, which surprised me particularly because the book opened up areas that nobody had ever talked to about Washington and Franklin. Talked about their partnership in the French and Indian War, when they first got to know each other, when Washington was head of the Virginia militia, and Franklin was head of the Pennsylvania militia, and of course, as you all know here, they don't know most of the country, that war was over the forks of the Ohio, the area that was claimed by both Virginia and Pennsylvania at the time, as well as, unfortunately, the French. And but at the other end, by the end, Franklin had become head of the president of the first, and at that time only, abolitionist society in America. It had turned completely against slavery, and Washington was still the owner of slavery and was president. And when Franklin came out of the convention, trying to use every avenue that was in the Constitution to oppose slavery, and he filed petitions in Congress to have Congress go to the edge that it can to limit slavery. And that led to really a fierce battle between, it was proxied, as much of Washington, early Washington administration was proxied through Madison, his prime minister, as they called him at the time, before Hamilton sort of replaced him in that role. and Franklin, and the battles that went on in Congress, and the writings that that Franklin was doing, and the private letters that Washington was writing. People were fascinated by that conflict between the two. I would argue, I hate to say this in Jefferson's home, but Jefferson himself said it, that the two key founders, the two indispensable founders, were not Jefferson. They were Franklin and Washington. Jefferson said it himself. Jefferson argued to Washington when Franklin died, you should make a special recognition because you two are in a whole different level than the rest of us. And I think he was right on that score. And there are differences over that issue of how the two iconic figures of liberty, and that's how they were viewed. They were viewed as iconic figures of liberty. The two national heroes of the Revolution were on opposite sides over the issue of can chattel slavery continue. And people were very interested in that because, is it fair to say the issue has been politicized?
We'll get to that in a moment. I'm still reeling about the Jefferson business.
You can reel all you want. Jefferson was a great man and a great president. But as a founder of their iconic status, before he wasn't president yet, the iconic status of Franklin and Washington at the time when the Constitution ratification, that was the main argument for ratification in every state. From Georgia to New Hampshire, the main argument was whether Franklin and Washington are for it, how can it be a mistake? How their differences, that they go, and the interest in that. So I knew people were interested in it. And as anybody who reads Summer for the Gods, my treatment of the Scopes trial, as a historian, I try to go back. I don't try to write judgments. I can't judge, we can't judge in a way. But we can look back and we can present to people what actually happened then, which includes how people back then judged, as long as you use their standards. And given the interest in that, my editor suggested, well, why don't you just, that's what people are interested in, that's what people are talking about, just turn it into a whole book. And I said, a whole book about Washington versus Jefferson, Washington versus Franklin on the issue of, no, cover the period, because no historian, and this is a little surprising, but I think he's right, and he was a good editor. No one has ever looked at that period. If I look for a model, it'd be Morgan, a great historian who had been part of the old liberty consensus coming out of the late 40s and 50s. He was part of the group with Hofstadter and the whole thing about America being an unfolded pageant of liberty. And then the civil rights movement came. And at that senior age, he goes back to Virginia and says, I'm going to rethink this. And he writes American Freedom, American Slavery, about the 1600s in Virginia. And he tried to fairly go back to all the original documents, and this is before they were online, to try to rethink what was happening in Virginia during the 1600s, where it could be a birthplace of liberty and also a birthplace of chattel slavery. Now, may not get everything right. I mean, there's been a lot of history since then, but I wanted to do the exact same thing about the Revolutionary era.
Well, and I have Edmund Morgan's name several places in my notes. We may come back to Edmund Morgan, because I think there's a lot of interesting parallels between what you're saying and what he said about this. But you had mentioned the politicalization, but what you're not mentioning, there's another thing perhaps fortuitous, perhaps it's merely happenstance about your timing with this book, which is its relationship to the 1619 Project. And clearly that is in the atmosphere as you're writing this and in your thoughts. And you have sort of an interesting take on it implicitly in what you're saying here. Maybe you could tell us, what do you think the 1619 Project gets right, and what do you think it gets wrong based on your new study?
Well, rather than piece out, because you really have two sides. The Trump administration countered with a book put out, I don't know who was the head of it, the head of Hillsdale College or something. Yeah, right. Which puts out another view. You have views coming out from different parts. Let me just preface this, and then I'll go back to directly answering your question. Harold Holzer, who's the great Lincoln historian and winner of the Lincoln Prize and amazing historian, he wrote the review of this book for the Wall Street Journal. It's very, and it was a review where he really unpacked things that were in it. and ended up, Wall Street Journal made it the whole first page. I never knew what the Wall Street Journal was going to say because of the 1619 project. And when Holzer gets to the end, his last line is, now we know what happened, it's up to us to decide what to do about it. And I thought that was very fair. I wasn't telling people what to do about it. But with this politicization, and your question was, and I'll get right to your question of right and wrong, is the people who did the 1619 project, just like the people who wrote Trump's rebuttal, were not historians. I mean, the head of Hillsdale College wasn't a historian, and they were journalists. And with the 1619, they were journalists. And they can bring a lot of issues to the front. They can do a lot of service. But to go back, to parallel it with My Summer for the Gods, no one had ever gone back to the Scopes trial, even though everyone said that's the birth of the culture wars in America. No historian had ever gone back to it. No historian, only journalists had written books about it, or a science fiction writer wrote The Great Monkey Trial. But no historian had written a book. And there's certain skills that historians have to bring about an analysis. And so what I wanted to do was go to the Revolutionary era, not go back to 1619, but take what historians view, mainstream historians view as the Revolutionary era, basically from the Stamp Act crisis to the solidification of the government at some point in the Washington administration. So I picked 1765 to 1795. And take a historian's skills, because even if you look at the footnotes of the 1619 project, they don't cite history. They don't cite any primary sources. They cite some secondary sources, but most of them are not by historians. The main one is by a law professor in New Jersey, at Rutgers, who's not writing a historical tract. So go back and look at the materials, which I had gotten to know from writing the book about the return of George Washington and the election of Magnificent Catastrophe and Franklin and Washington. Go through those materials and see that at the time of when this whole crisis starts, think of it. America was the home of a new version, and the British colonies in the Caribbean, I shouldn't leave those out, was a home of a new form of chattel slavery. It was different than whatever slavery, whenever the Whig people in Britain, Addison and Steele or Locke, are talking about slavery, they have some vision of slavery in Rome. Certainly slavery had already existed, but it hadn't been constructed like chattel slavery out of the Barbados slave code and then carried through to South Carolina and then adopted for Virginia in the very early 1700s. So we had this institution of chattel slavery where these black slaves, enslaved people, are owned like animals, like domesticated animals. And their offspring by the mother are owned in that same way. They didn't have that formalized. Maybe the Brits are good about writing the laws around things and formalizing things, but they had in Barbados and carried up here. So we were the home of this particular form of chattel slavery when there was no slavery in England. Slavery had been abolished in England with the fall of the Romans hundreds of years earlier. There had been no slavery in England, though the English Whig writers who says, we don't want to be slaves of the Hanoverian monarchs. They were using that rhetoric. But they didn't have chattel slavery. It didn't have the same resonance. So here we were the home of chattel slavery, and here was an upsurge of a fight for liberty. And liberty is an intellectual idea. And liberty has been around, same way with slavery. It had been around since ancient times. It had been around, the Greeks had talked about it, but not like we were talking about it, because we have been thinking about Americans in the 1700s, the British beginning with the Glorious Revolution, Locke, Rousseau, there's a new Enlightenment concept of what individual liberty is. We're all born in nature, we're born free, and all born free and equal, like Jefferson would write about it, and we make certain deals for stability and for government. This idea, this was a Lockean, this was a Rousseauian concept. And so that was grasped onto. It was already in the English literature. Now Americans grasped onto it, white Americans with resources, Washington, Jefferson, Hancock, Samuel Adams, doesn't matter. You can go all the way from the Carolinas to New Hampshire. They're all saying the same thing. We don't want to be enslaved. John Adams said it clearly, repeatedly. We do not want to be Parliament's Negroes. That's the way he said it, repeatedly. And they all said things like this. And so they could take the slavery, and at that time there was a new song in England that was the most popular song. It was only a few years old then, Rural Britannia, and the refrain is, we Britons will never, never, never be slaves. This was popular. Brand new song became an unofficial national anthem. It's popular there. It was popular here. That refrain was, Samuel Adams was particularly gifted at using that refrain in his letters and in his newspaper articles. They knew this rhetoric of slavery, or the metaphor of slavery, sang in America, borrowed from the Whigs in England, borrowed from the anti-monarchists in England. It sang in America because they all, whether they were from New Hampshire to Georgia, they all saw chattel slavery in a way that they never saw in England. And they could, this metaphor worked. It helped galvanize. Well, Adams wrote to Jefferson once. He said, this revolution was not born on the military field. It was born in the writings. It was born in the newspaper articles. You look at the pamphlets and the articles to see where this started until the war carried it on. And I think he was right. And it was born in this, so this interaction of the reality of slavery with an honest cries for liberty. And so I don't think I was interested in this intricate balance, this play of how slavery and liberty, the concepts, the fact of slavery and the concepts of liberty. And where I differ is I believe the patriots like Jefferson were fighting for liberty. They weren't fighting to maintain slavery. But they weren't necessarily fighting to end slavery.
I think that's right. And what Ed's referring to is one of the conclusions, there are many, it's a complicated document, the 1619 Project. One of the conclusions is that that's why the American Revolution was fought. And so Ed's disagreeing with that. But I want to push back. You're going to get me to Edmund Morgan more quickly than I planned, because Edmund Morgan, for those who aren't familiar, American Slavery, American Freedom, great book. And one of the things he points out is that unlike most revolutions, if we think about revolutions, at least in the last couple hundred years, the French, that was a revolution, the French Revolution. You know, we're chopping off people's heads, we're burning things down. The Russian Revolution, that was a revolution. The American Revolution is not like that. And it's critically not like that, using Morgan's thesis, which I've always thought was very powerful, because the powerful high-class whites were able to bring on board the lower class whites. We're not going to have a class revolution, and one of the ways they did it is by othering blacks, is Morgan's argument. That therefore we're all against them. So we're together in this fight against slavery, both from Britain, and we know what slavery is because no one knew better than they what slavery was. You hadn't talked too much about what the 1619 Project gets right. What about this idea of othering as a critical element for the American Revolution?
Well, first, I think Edmund Morgan, what has been most criticized in his work, American Slavery, American Freedom, accept the Stamp Act. If we accept the Townsend duties, we will be suffering the worst form of slavery imaginable. We will be totally enslaved. If they can take our property without consent, then they quote Locke, we will be, and I'm saying, really? Are they seeing this? Are they, I mean, Dickinson's getting rich. I mean, are they really seeing, but they're all using this metaphor. And they're all saying it'll be the worst sport of slavery. So what are they thinking? It leads some of them, see, and this is where it differs, it leads some of them, it leads many of them to turn against slavery. The first great pamphlet of the whole period is Otis'S. pamphlet. It's a year before that. He hears it's coming, and he writes this wonderful pamphlet in 1764 against the Stamp Act, which resonated. I mean, it was the first big pamphlet. And he says, we won't be enslaved. But then he says, neither should we enslave black people. He says it right in it. He leaves that. John Hancock, he gives up on slavery. Benjamin Franklin, of course, becomes leader of Abolitionist Society. Samuel Adams. You can rattle off the names of these people who say, well, we can't be enslaved, therefore we can't enslave others. And the Revolutionary period does lead to the first great, factually, I mean, I don't care what rhetoric says, factually, it led to the first great emancipation of African Americans in the history of the world. In the North, during the war, during the height of the war, Massachusetts ends slavery, New Hampshire ends slavery, Pennsylvania ends slavery, Rhode
Vermont,
Island.
but they don't count.
Vermont ends slavery, right, in their constitution. Well, they do count in the long run because they're going to become a state. New Hampshire and Connecticut are on the way, New York and New Jersey. There is, and that can be tied to the Revolution. And all these states, colonies and then states, include African Americans into their militias. And by joining their militia, they automatically are always made free. And so blacks fought in, you name it, Lexington and Concord, they fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill, they fought in them all, and they all got their freedom. Now, the South plays it out differently. But that's the complex interaction. I still couldn't find any Southerners, and I looked and looked. I couldn't find anyone that says, we are fighting this revolution because we're afraid that England is going to end slavery in America. Nobody was making that argument because I don't think there's anyone in the South or the North who ever thought England would ever end slavery in the colonies.
No, it's the 19th century. I mean, we project back, 19th century thing about slavery. I want to come back to all of this. As you may be gathering from this conversation, one thing that's interesting about this book, I want to shift gears a little bit because it struck me as reading. Ed points out, and certainly historians of the 18th, 19th century would understand this, how pervasive slavery is in the discussion because it's there. 1/5 of Americans were enslaved at this point in time. Much higher percentages in the South than in the North, but also in the North. Thousands of enslaved people in New York, Massachusetts, several
12% of the population in New York.
In New York. So it's pervasive. It's there all of the time. So I want to switch gears a little bit to your role as an author. When I was working on my PhD a few years back now, I had thought about dealing with slavery. And one of the reasons I did not, we can come to the specific issue, was how difficult it was to read the material because how deeply disgusting and depressing it was. Now, John Meacham's review of your book in the New York Times, he says that it unemotional account. It was an unemotional account of slavery and the pervasiveness of slavery. As an author, how did you grapple with the emotion and the difficulty of this issue as you were writing this?
Well, it was emotional for me. There were times when I was reading these materials that I was using or quoting from them or reading over the text, because I like to read out loud what I write, when I'd be crying. So it wasn't unemotional in that sense. But I also thought that I should write, I did not want to be judgmental. I did not want, and I've not been accused of this by anyone, that I'm taking my standards and going back and imposing them on Jefferson or Washington or Hancock or Franklin or anyone else. Because what you find is these words of liberty, whether they're spoken by Patrick Henry and not applied to ending slavery at all, indeed quite the opposite in his case, or you apply them to John Hancock or Samuel Adams on the other, who refused to take any enslaved persons, or Gouverneur Morris. They, as Meacham said, they all confronted this issue. They all thought about it, and other people reacted. And so what I'm trying to do is tell the story in a detached fashion crossing every T, dotting every I and J in the footnotes. So I'm always using their words and not what any other historian ever interpreted their words, and laying them out so you can see what they were thinking and they were doing. And yes, it is difficult to deal with, but heck, I was trapped in place in COVID. I thought it was important to provide a balanced account that I thought should be able to be read by both sides, by the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, and both of them say, well, this is what happened. And if I was being judgmental, I couldn't do that. So it was, some of this was difficult to read. But if you put anything in its historical context, it also becomes more understandable as you read it. And so you can read people like the general from Massachusetts at the ratifying convention in Massachusetts saying, well, I used to like Washington, but the man still owns slaves.
Well, and it's not only emotional, right? There are parts of the book that are emotional to read. There are parts of the book that are difficult to read. What Ed's not saying, when I have the opportunity to give tours here at Monticello, I always point out, and this is very relevant to some of our modern debates, if we believe in those principles, it's important, those American principles, it's important to read the failures. That's how we learn. But you also read, one of the advantages of this is you also read the successes. Absolutely.
If you get an account that all the whites were bad and all the whites were trying to destroy this thing but then you read the story and they say that every signer of the Declaration of Independence was a slaveholder except John Adams, and of course John Adams is quite mixed. It comes off mixed in the book. But then you find out, well, that's not really true. It's a little more complex than that. John Hancock is the first person who signs it. John Hancock, technically owned slaves, technically, but the only reason I discovered, and this was encouraging, is he didn't own any enslaved people, and then his uncle dies, and unexpectedly, and his uncle is like one of the richest people in the Americas. Huge fleets of ship owning and
very American, inherit your wealth.
Inherit your wealth. He did. That's why it's called American inheritance. He was a slave trader and owned quite a few enslaved people. And Hancock says, I'm not taking any of you. None of you are coming into my house as enslaved. You can come in as employees and I'll pay you. Samuel Adams did the same thing when he married and his wife brought enslaved property with her. None of you are coming in as enslaved. You can walk away. You can do whatever you want. I'm not taking you in that respect. But technically he still owned them because before the American Revolution, and Jefferson comes into this story, you could not free your enslaved property. It was not possible. If you wanted in Virginia to free your enslaved property, you had to go get a special bill passed by the House of Burgesses, and you had to meet certain qualifications. Oh, they did something extraordinary. They saved your life. They pulled you out of a fire. Something extraordinary for that one individual. And in Massachusetts, the only way you could, before the Revolution, you could free your enslaved person would be to put up this bond, this large bond, which would cover their expenses if they can award of the state. Even Hancock couldn't afford that bond for all of the enslaved people. I mean, it was a sizable sum. Nobody could afford it. So what these people did is they didn't put up the bond. They just said, go away, or you can come here. Do what you want. You're an employee from now on. So is that really a slaveholder or not? So it's tough. And so you find out that people did react. So there are a lot of encouraging stories like John Hancock or Benjamin Franklin. There are a lot of encouraging stories here. And there's also an enormous number of encouraging stories about African Americans because they heard these words too. And these African Americans are just walking away, or they're protesting, or in Massachusetts you get an upsurge of freedom petitions because there they can petition, free or enslaved blacks can petition the government. Freedom suits, they upsurged during the Revolution. And when when the British declared that any enslaved person from a patriot household comes to British lines, they're automatically free. So when the British come down this way, when they send Cornwallis romping around in Virginia, or Clinton down in Georgia and North Carolina, blacks pour out, including from Monticello.
This is Monticello and Mount Vernon for that matter.
They pour out of these places. And so you do see this is not just a story among whites. This rhetoric African Americans were responding to and seeking their freedom either by serving in the colonial militia up north, or the state, or petitioning for their freedom, or in the South, going to the British.
And as Ed said, I mean, it is a complicated story. There's good parts of it. There's very bad parts of it. We want to recognize both those. But again, there's parts of this that are disturbing to read, because as you read them, you say, we had a fellow here at the International Center just this past week was talking about the British when they removed from the United States at the end of the war, took over 10,000 African Americans with them. However, the interesting part, I had not heard the statistics before, only a third of those were free.
Right.
2/3 of them were still enslaved to British officers, because as Ed says, if you were the enslaved of a patriot, the British would give you freedom. But if you were enslaved by a loyalist,
Right.
you're still going to be enslaved.
So they weren't enslaved by British officers.
By loyalists.
By loyalists who were then going to Florida,
Jamaica, Florida.
And they took their enslaved property with them. But the ones from loyalists, like several of Jefferson's people and enslaved people, and several of Washington's, the ones that survived the smallpox, which was more likely if we were Washington's than Jefferson's, because Jefferson didn't inoculate them, from Charleston, from Savannah, and from New York. If they had promised them their liberty, they did not turn them back.
No.
And they kept their word, and some went to England, some went to Nova Scotia, lots went to Nova Scotia, and some were given the option of resettling back in Liberia.
Right. Eventually Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone
initially.
Not Liberia, excuse me.
Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone.
We have a few more questions, and then we want to open it up. I want to get back to some of the difficulty, because we've not really been progressing chronologically intentionally, but a little bit. We've been talking about the American Revolution. Talk about the American Constitution, because I tend to agree with you about the complexity of the American Revolution on the issue of slavery, quite complex, and I want to come back to the issue of manumission if we have time, the idea of freeing the enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitution is often a different story among historians, that the Constitution is often seen as a retrograde step. The idea that the Constitution is a bargain with the devil, because the Constitution preserves slavery.
Right.
Never uses the term, doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. How do you grapple with the Constitution? How do you see the Constitution on that issue? Is it a step back from that revolutionary moment when all things seemed possible?
I think I do spend a whole chapter on the Constitution, where I look through the compromises, and a whole chapter on the ratification, including in Virginia. Lots of work on the ratification debates down in Richmond for the ratification of the Constitution, and you see a lot of it played out there. And I think you ask the wrong question if you say, is the Constitution pro-slavery or anti-slavery? Because it sort of throws you off. It sets the tone, and so you get a group of scholars, and you went back to Garrison, on one side, and you get a group, and you go back to Frederick Douglass on the other side, that it's not. What my conclusion is that it's neither. Because by now, the two sides were so entrenched. The North was so committedly, you're an expert on religion, a lot of it based on the fact that the Congregationalist Church had flipped over and was rabidly abolitionist by this time, by the time of the Constitutional Convention. The North was so abolitionist, and they had already got the deal, or they cut the deal during this time for the Northwest Territories, so they were going to be able to project free soil west. Meanwhile, the South knew it was going to get Kentucky and Tennessee and was going to protect slavery west. So the country was divided on this issue, and Madison repeatedly says, at the Constitution, repeatedly says, what are you guys fighting about? The difference is not between small states and large states. It's not between agricultural states and urban states. It's not between big producers of export goods and small farmers. The only difference that divides us is free states versus slave states. He says that repeatedly. And we know he said it repeatedly because he wrote the notes and he put it in. He put it in repeatedly.
Some of it later, he put it back in.
He put it back in. So I think what they did is they knew when they went to the Constitution, if you go to Franklin or Washington, and you can follow on down, it doesn't matter, but they were the two big names there. But it would be true of Hamilton and Madison, and whoever you want to pick. The people who went there to Philadelphia, what they were committed was not to slavery or against slavery. They went there to create a commercial union. They wanted one nation that controlled interstate and international commerce because they wanted a trading union. They thought they also wanted a strong central government that could tax and spend for the general welfare. They wanted a federal government that could have an army so they could push both the British and the Native Americans out of the West and open the West. That was a major concern of Jefferson. He wanted to open the West for his small yeoman farmers. Washington and Franklin thought the future lied in the frontier. And so they wanted a stronger union, and the ones who didn't want that didn't go. The Patrick Henrys who were signed up, they didn't want a stronger federal union. They didn't go because Rhode Island didn't go, and they thought they were going to need all 13 states, and they thought it was a waste of time. So that's their goal. And then the question is, how do we get over this major divide of slavery? And so Franklin was willing to put his abolitionist views aside, not submit the petition that his organization had asked him to submit. Let's stamp all that down, no matter how much we were abolitionist or how much we were pro-slavery, and come up with a constitution. If it had been anti-slavery, it would have never been ratified in the South. And if it had been pro-slavery, it would have never been ratified in the North. And so they come up with a constitution that is silent on slavery at the national level, but protects and preserves and allows for the extension of state-sanctioned slavery at the state level. Hence, that's why they add the enumerated powers that do not include slavery. That's what they want the 11th Amendment for. That's why they come up with the Three-Fifths Compromise, because the whole logic of the Three-Fifths Compromise, which was invented by Madison, was that if we give 3/5 of a vote for every enslaved person, there will be the same number of congressmen and electoral votes from the South as the North. It balances the two. And so you will have a natural check and balance so that they can't move either for slavery or against slavery. So I view it as a carefully, but they couldn't put the word slavery in because it never would have been ratified in the North. So I think it was a carefully calculated compromise designed not to protect slavery or promote slavery at the federal level. There are a couple exceptions. Those were the controversial ones. But to protect state-sanctioned slavery at the state level.
It's a punt. Although, I mean, I think it's interesting.
It's a compromise.
I think that the Constitution is much more, the argument beyond slavery, that the Constitution has some reactionary elements, commercially reactionary elements, is much stronger.
Different
issue. You were saying something about preserving the ability of the slave states to be slave states. It also preserves the ability of the free states to be free states. And I want to get to sort of a middle group, which I thought, one thing I was surprised about your book was, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, is this issue of manumission. The idea, people could believe, we know benightedly, but people in Virginia could believe that slavery would be eliminated in time. We know that wasn't going to happen until we have the Civil War. But the North has gradual emancipation. The Deep South was not going to do that. Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, all changed their manumission laws dramatically at the end of the Revolution, so you can free your enslaved people. By the time of the Civil War, 50% of the blacks in Maryland are free because of manumission. By the time of the Civil War, over 90% of the blacks in Delaware are free because of voluntary. The states never eliminate slavery. You can still have slavery in those states. Virginia liberalizes manumission in 1782. And suddenly, and again, Jefferson and Madison are saying, see, the state's going to deal with the problem itself. And suddenly the number of free blacks in Virginia skyrockets. If that had continued to the Civil War, over 50% of the blacks in Virginia would have been free at the time of the Civil War. Imagine, that's a different world. That's a very different world if 50% of the blacks in Virginia have been free. Gets to be 1806, the laws changed, and the number flattens out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know I'm going past your period. You stopped in 1795. I was surprised you didn't talk more about those middle states and about this ambivalence. So you're talking about the freedom-loving northern states. They have these revolutionary concepts, and they're going to be free. The southern states are still bound to the issue of chattel slavery in its most vicious form. The middle states, and Virginia being most obvious, makes some movement but then fails.
It's part of the complexity, but when you work out what I wrote about everything you were talking about, you could see in my discussion of where the parties were at the Constitutional Convention. It's the two Carolinas and Georgia that are insisting on the extension of the Atlantic slave trade. Virginia's ready to end it. So's Maryland, so's Delaware. They insist on that. And that turns out to be the most controversial issue in the North for ratification, with the argument being, we now as a country are taking over power over international commerce, which we didn't have before. But you're carving out an exception to preserve and extend and expand slavery. And fitting with that, as a result, only those three states, and if you read the Constitution, the state has to decide if it wants to continue the Atlantic slave trade. Those three states did. During the 20 years, just as the Northerners predicted, more enslaved people were brought into America from Africa than during the entire colonial period before. During the entire period before, in those 20 years, because they knew they had 20 years to bring them all in. So you're right. There's a difference between exactly what Mason was saying and what Virginians were saying and what they might believe. But my contention in the book, and this is where I'll differ with some other more conservative historians, is I do not believe that anyone there, I could not find any evidence that anyone back then of any prominence believed that slavery was dying away in all of the Americas, maybe in Delaware, but all of the Americas, or would die away. And so you have people like Gouverneur Morris saying, if we at the Constitutional Convention, if we make these compromises, it's only going to end in a civil war. That's the only result that this can happen, but I'm going to go along with it because I so believe in a stronger union. So I do not believe whatever they thought might happen in Virginia, they did not believe that slavery was dying out, and they believed that it was going to be projected forward into what would become Alabama and Mississippi. So I do think it's a different story in the middle states, but we see that different story coming out in exactly their nuanced position. And the best example you could have given of that sort, I think, is Luther Martin from Maryland.
Well, it's interesting. What I was trying to move you around to, but failed, is that I think one of the things that happens in Virginia, and back to our discussion about the 1619 Project, is the othering of the black. It becomes so intense. Yeah. And it's interesting that as we start seeing a significant free black population in Virginia, still small on a percentage basis, we're starting to see thousands of free blacks, suddenly it becomes much easier to other, because they're uppity. They want their rights. They want to, they want to walk down the street without being pushed aside. And we do get a retraction. 1806, yeah. Fascinating story as to Virginia, which had, in this revolutionary moment, And I'll disagree a little bit. You know, Jefferson thought, and again, we know this was not going to happen now, but he thought if we dilute slavery, if we start having free blacks, if we spread it out, maybe someday we'll be able to eliminate slavery in Virginia.
But now you're talking Virginia, not
Virginia,
America.
in Virginia,
no,
absolutely.
I agree there.
Yeah.
I agree there.
But then it falls apart in 1806. Jefferson's in Washington. He avoids the battle in 1806. He doesn't comment much on it. But there's this retraction that occurs.
Well, and when he does come back, he participates in it by the time he comes back.
In the manumission or in the institution?
In the institution.
Oh, absolutely.
He doubles down on the
Absolutely.
institution after he comes back and he retired. But even the othering could be traced in part to notes in Virginia, notes in the state of
Yes.
Virginia, because there's a lot of othering going
Absolutely.
on in the notes of the state of Virginia.
Absolutely. I mean, it always surprised me. Thomas Jefferson, in notes, for those not familiar, Thomas Jefferson says some wonderful things, by the way, on religious freedom in the notes of the state of Virginia. He says some terrible things about African Americans, and some of it he had to have known. He talks about the difference in blood. He had seen blood. For him to talk about the difference in blood,
Yeah.
it's unfathomable to me.
Well, he's following Hume. He read Hume and was following Hume, but he was making an argument that essentially blacks were a different species of animal from whites.
And I'm going to, because I want to get to questions, you talk about the polygenesis versus monogenesis. It's interesting. I was going to ask, Native Americans adopt a polygenesis attitude because they're finding that the Europeans are placing them with the blacks, and so they come up with, no, God created white, red, and black because they wanted to be different. So this becomes, this othering becomes central.
You get Franklin's funny line. It was controversial. The only time Franklin ever lost an election, he was elected president of Pennsylvania unanimously 3 times. But early on in the 50s, he wrote a tract against all the German immigration, and he called the Germans tawny. I don't know why they're tawny, but there was a lot of German immigration. So he wrote a pamphlet against that, and he says, we don't have any need for the tawny. We're the land of the beautiful white and the red. He was very, very sensitive to the Native Americans, and published their literature. And so, yeah, he was following right down that line. America should be the land of the beautiful white, the beautiful red and the white.
So these issues have been going on. We've been talking a long time, but I'd be very interested in getting some comments from our guests today. If people have questions for Ed, I see, yes, Lige. Oh, wait, they want you to have a microphone.
So thank you very much. I can't wait to read the book. The fabulous conversation. My question is about the singulars. Actually, I'm curious about a number of singulars in your title, but I'm particularly interested in the nation and the birth of a nation. It's hard for me to hear that and not think of D.W. Griffith and another local boy, Woodrow Wilson. For Griffith, it's actually the Civil War that births the nation and actually Reconstruction and the Southern resistance to it. I'm curious to know why you see a birth of a nation taking place in this period. And everything you've said suggests to me that there isn't a single nation on this subject in the early national period. My own preference is to say we actually see 13 different positions on this before the admission of Vermont, and then 14, 15, and 16. And Jefferson himself says this, that the Constitution is actually an international treaty between states when slavery is the subject. So I'm wondering what you're thinking of, how do you think of this as a nation? Is there a single inheritance on this at this point?
When you limit it, when you focus on just the issue of slavery, I agree. The original Virginia plan, as you know, or as you may know, was drafted, we think was drafted by the Pennsylvania and Virginia delegates together when they were at Philadelphia. And it's open-ended on the powers of the national government. They say nation. In the Virginia plan, always says nation, national government, which is dropped out of the final Constitution. So they call it a national government. And they say that the national government will have all power over things that are national. No enumeration. The enumeration comes later, tied to your governor of Virginia, who suddenly begins to see, wait, we got to make sure that slavery is not included in this. And so the enumerated powers, as he came back and told the Virginia Ratifying Convention, as Madison told the Virginia Ratification Convention, as the Pinckneys, Charles and Charles Coatsworthy, his cousin, and the governor of South Carolina, explained to the people in South Carolina, the central government has no power to regulate slavery in any form because it's not listed in the enumerated powers. Now Patrick Henry comes back and says, well, look at the necessary and proper clause. They'll use that somehow. And he comes up with all the reasons why they'll do it. He's very blunt. He uses a word I wouldn't use, but he tells them they'll take your, and then you put the word in there. That's what he said at Virginia. And Madison and Randolph said they wouldn't. So you're right. On the issue of slavery, they were not becoming a nation. They were coming up with this federal system. So they dropped the word nation. But remember, that's in the original document. And now you think about what are the most important things. If anyone thought, if Franklin in his dreams thought somehow this could be used to end slavery nationwide, and I think he did dream about them doing, I think he dreamed about that. He hoped that would happen. Gouverneur Morris hoped that would happen. Elderbridge Gerry hoped that would happen. It was that once we have a commercial union and a military union, so we have a NATO and a common market, if we have that, we have the elements of a nation. Not what the Virginia Plan originally called for, but we have the elements of a nation. And in that sense, it was the birth of a nation. And I am countering. I do not think the Civil War was the birth of the nation. I think Washington's vision and Hamilton's vision and the Federalist vision of the Constitution and Franklin's vision of the Constitution was the birth of a nation. And Washington calls himself an American after that, not a Virginian. And I do believe they thought it was the birth of a nation. And the question is, will it cover everything? But when you think of the importance of a national market economy, and you think of the importance of a national navy and a national military, and the movement of the frontier, yeah, they made a bargain. And Franklin made a bargain. I think it's more important to have union than to win on the slavery issue. And I think the same way Roger Sherman did the same thing and other Northerners did the same thing. And so I do think this in many ways was the birth of a nation, and I think Gouverneur Morris was right. A civil war was inevitable. Okay. And it was born then.
They're talking about civil war very early on.
They were. And repeatedly during the debates over Franklin's petition, all the Southerners were talking, if you agree with Franklin's petition, there is going to be a civil war. And you can read about that in that chapter that deals with it.
Okay. We have a few more questions. We have a few more minutes.
Good question, though.
Before we adjourn, and you can all go buy Ed's book and have him sign it.
Or enjoy the
yes,
weather.
Please.
I grew up in western North Carolina, western Virginia, where the German heritage is very strong, and the German attitude towards slavery, because many of them were indentured servants before slavery existed in this country. Why were they so quiet? Why did they not, the former indentured servants who were treated like slaves in many ways in this country, why did that go away? What is the history here? Why did no one condemn that as a system?
We're going to give different answers to this question.
Well, you can go first. I think it did inspire. I mean, Benjamin Franklin was an indentured servant. He fled from it to another state. And I think that helped drive his later becoming, once he became convinced from his own observation, remember he was a scientist, his own observations, which he wrote about in the 50s, that blacks were equal to whites. And he became to believe that, he turned on slavery. And I think his own experience. So I do think there is some of that. But you also see the Germans being the most reluctant group in Pennsylvania to the gradual abolitionist statute. And it was the Presbyterians and it was the religious groups that really pushed it.
Did the Baptists? in Virginia early on. The Baptists were anti-slavery. They withdraw
Methodists
from
too.
that position in no time. I mean, I think there's two other things that I would add, one of which I know you'll agree with, which is the people in the Valley and so on had less political power. That the power was in the Tidewater. But I come back to the issue of discussing, because I still agree with Edmund Morgan on othering, that I think the one thing that those white indentured servants knew, they weren't black. And that became very important in the Southern mentality. We saw that right up to the 1960s. We're still seeing that some today. And so that was the other reason that and so it's divided. We're talking about a people. Obviously, there were different views.
And we agree on the othering. It's not that we don't agree on the othering, where I think, I think the best evidence shows that the othering was always there and wasn't intentionally cultivated. But we totally agree on the importance of the othering, at least I'm not black. Absolutely, we totally agree on that.
Yeah, that's an argument. But and I think you're right about the revolution. It was not, that was not the reason. We maybe have time for one more question. I see somebody, please. Yes. I think they wanted a microphone because they're recording. So.
In terms of the othering, this is a little outside your time frame, but if you could speak to Bacon's rebellion as a way to sort of divide and conquer the white, lower class whites from the blacks?
He's read Edmund Morgan.
Read Edmund Morgan, and you're right, that's outside my time period. Slavery, part of it was that, one thing I'm convinced from reading Edmund Morgan and the others that Edmund Morgan probably doesn't emphasize enough, is the institution of slavery at the time of Bacon's rebellion was fundamentally different than the institution of slavery after the adoption of the Virginia slave code in, I think it was 1706 or 1704, in the first decade of the 1700s. And the status of enslaved blacks was not that much different than the status of indentured white servants. And fundamentally, these enslaved blacks, it was for their life, not necessarily their children. It was a form, conceptually, as Edmund Morgan reports, it's an ambiguous state, and we don't quite know. And in the Chesapeake, it was more indentured servitude. Inland, it was. Morgan goes into that. He finds it in the records. This is one of the great adventures of this book. And so, yes, I think he could well be right that these issues were floating around in Bacon's at the time of Bacon's rebellion, but how it would play out differently than it would at a different time. And you are more of an expert of that period than I am. So how would you deal with that question?
Well, the problem, historians, this is what I know. I don't want to talk about it.
Well, that's a little bit of my problem.
This is a little outside. I do think, for those of the historians, I tend to agree a little bit more with Paul Finkelman and so on, that the role of African Americans in the early 17th century was worse than some of the reports of indentured servitude, but it did vary. It varied. There were places where they were treated like indentured servants.
Correct.
There were other places where very early on it's pretty clearly chattel slavery.
I agree.
And then the slave code puts an end to it. We've got a resolution. But we want to stay on time, and I want to make sure that Ed has an opportunity to go to the bookstore and sign books. We want to thank you all. Thank you on behalf of Virginia Humanities.
Thank you for having me.
I will say on behalf of the International Center for Jefferson Studies here at Monticello, this is the first of 4 book events we're going to be holding over the course of the year, and we hope that you'll come back and join us. The next one is going to be June 13th. This will be on our website. It will be advertised by Derek Spears from Cornell, talking about the practice of citizenship and about black publishing in the very early America. So I hope you'll join us then as well. Ed,
thank you so much.